Over the course of his blood-smeared life, Guts has faced tons of enemies that could have been his last. He started off fighting men much bigger than him, and graduated to fighting monsters much bigger than him, and peaked when he finally found opponents that even he couldn't touch, let alone fight. The God Hand. Being supernatural entities whose existence is more ethereal than real, the God Hand simply cannot be touched. And Guts struggled with that harsh reality for over 300 chapters, until he killed a god, pretty much all by himself. Fans that were keeping up the series as it was dropping back then might hate this part of the story as the dreaded boat arc, but honestly, we kinda love it, because to us, it's proof that Guts can now possibly kill the God Hand, and in this video, we'll explain why that's the case. Guts vs. Sea God Round 1. A ghost ship and tentacle monsters. The reason why most people dislike Berserker's boat arc is twofold. The first is how long it took Miura to get a single chapter out back in the day, especially once he began nearing the Fantasia. That reason can be considered unavoidable, but the second one cannot, which is Captain Bonebeard. Why Miura felt the need to add a Disney pirate to the series, complete with references to Davy Jones's locker, we will never understand. Or at least we thought we wouldn't, until they were all devoured by the sea god and turned into his thralls. After that, Bonebeard became a far more important character to the boat arc, whether you liked it or not. If you guys want to find out more about the Sea God and how he was able to turn Bonebeard's crew into his slaves, check out our Sea God anatomy video, because we go into a lot more detail on his abilities over there. For this video, we're just going to mention the relevant bits, like how catching Bonebeard's crew way out at sea from a stationary position was indicative of the havoc it could wreak when unleashed. In chapter 308, the Sea God's tentacle whiskers devour Bonebeard's crew and use his ship to attack Roderick's seahorse. The Ithian captain was shocked to see Bonebeard's battered Karak keeping up with his warship at such a pace, but he knew a couple of volleys would sort that situation. What made his jaw hit the floor was the fact that when his cannonballs were supposed to blow up the Captain Sharkrider's deck, and yes, that is the name of Bonebeard's ship, the Captain Sharkrider, the damn thing dove underwater. The reason for this is simple. The inside of the ship was now home to a giant sea god slug that allowed it to move like no other ship in the world could. Captain Sharkrider kept pressing forward underwater, and if Roderick hadn't been as good of a sailor as he was, the seahorse would have capsized. Thanks to him, they moved themselves towards starboard at the last possible moment and saved themselves from death by drowning. If they'd fallen in the water, it would have been terrible, because the tentacle monsters that were a part of Bonebeard's crew would just swarm and devour them. That doesn't mean that they didn't devastate Roderick's ranks regardless, because just as the seahorse stabilized, the captain of the Captain Sharkrider addressed his soon-to-be victims. He played out a Scooby-Doo villain routine with Isidro once he realized these were the same kids that beat him at Vertanis Harbor, but that's where the cartoonish likeness ended. Unlike a Scooby-Doo villain, Bonebeard hadn't been captured when he cursed out these meddling kids. Instead, he was in the position to capture said kids as he surrounded the seahorse with dozens of tentacle monsters. They started eating their way through the ship's crew, then the ship itself, which sent the former into a panic. Roderick knew that the tide of battle could have been changed by a single swordsman. He was in awe of Guts when he kept a ship's mast from falling onto his party during their fight against Ganishka, but he didn't want to rely on him because he had also witnessed just how much using the Berserker armor took out of him with each use firsthand. After surviving 3 waves of battle that humans could only dream of living through, Guts' body must have been akin to a pig on a spit. He fought off dozens of Daka and Makara, then dealt with the diamond-crushing pressure of Daiba's Kundalini, and also tanked at least 3 lightning bolt strikes from Emperor Ganishka himself. Oh, and did we mention that he channeled a spirit of fire through Dragonslayer by using his own body as an intermediary? The only reason he was able to carry on throughout all that was because he had the Berserker armor. Otherwise, the Wheel of Fire would have burnt him alive. His first battle as the Berserker took him a month to recover from, and it wasn't nearly as exhausting as what happened at Vertanis Bay. So naturally, relying on Guts wasn't an option Roderick thought he could use. But turns out, Guts would have showed up regardless because the Sea God slug started making his brand bleed, and whenever that happens, it can only mean one thing: trouble. Now, as for why the brand of sacrifice reacted to creatures that don't seem to be apostles, well, the answer is evil. Cast your minds back to the first time Guts' party came into contact with Emperor Ganishka's Pishachagana. For those of you who haven't read the manga yet, it was in chapter 239, where several crocodile Pishacha swarmed the hut that Guts' group was using as a shelter. Even before they could see these Pishacha, Guts sensed them because their presence made his brand bleed. The same thing happens to him in the presence of Ganishka's Daka, though that one might be a bit more understandable considering the Abyss is directly involved in their creation. The Pishacha are familiars created through spirit possession, which means that they take on their demonic forms because of the sorcerers that possess their bodies. It's those sorcerers who are using the power of evil to fuel these Pishacha, and that evil power is what makes Guts' brand bleed, not necessarily the direct presence of an apostle or god hand. The Sea God is the very definition of evil in these parts of the world. He devours all that are within his reach without discrimination and then assimilates their souls within him, which is basically defiling them by denying them an afterlife. He even shares a feature with the main villain of Berserk. We'll address that in a later segment. For now, let's turn our focus back to round 1, because in a way, the Sea God's slugs are his pseudo-apostles. And we know just how easily Guts can deal with those by now. He demonstrates our point by cutting down every tentacle monster that threatened to eat Roderick's sailors, half asleep and on an empty stomach. 2 swings from Dragon Slayer take out half a dozen of them, so you can guess how much time it took him to kill the rest. He nearly killed one of the people he was trying to save, but luckily, they got the message and got out of his way. What proceeded was a one-sided slaughter as Bonebeard villain monologued his way through watching his Hardies die. You'd have thought that he'd be more upset, but he wasn't, because the pirate had another trick up his sleeve. Just as Guts finished up cutting off the tentacle monsters, their real body emerged from the depth. Turns out, each tentacle was just a whisker adorning the mouth of a gigantic sea slug that looks just like the Kraken from Pirates of the Caribbean. The sight of it scared everyone that wasn't Guts. The Black Swordsman simply loaded up his arm cannon, fired it point blank into the creature's mouth, and used the momentum to execute his signature twisting blast slash. That's a good name, right? Studio Gaga, you can pay us for that one. This sends the Kraken drowning, and before Bonebeard can respond, Roderick's men riddle his ship with cannon fire. It felt like he was about to say they had another sea slug in their ship, which is possible, as you'll learn soon enough, but with the holes in his vessel and the sun coming up, the pirate knew better than to press a disadvantage. He comically tries to sign off his departure, but his body is pulled under the sea, presumably by the Sea God himself. Round 1 between the Sea God's slug monsters and the Black Swordsman is a clear victory for the latter, though there were other elements that ensured things didn't get out of hand. Those elements would be missing from their next encounter. Guts vs. Sea God, Round 2. The Lone Berserker against an entire island. The next time Guts encounters the tentacles and Bonebeard isn't long after their previous encounter, but by now we have more context regarding the latter's constitution. The Sea God had been confined to Isma's Island a long time ago by a group of Marrows. Usually, it would only be active during nights of the full moon, for they held a special astral significance, but otherwise things were business as usual. Then, the great roar of the astral world occurred and knocked loose all barriers that were holding back dangerous spiritual creatures. The Sea God was one of these, of course, and the proof wasn't just in the fact that Bonebeard and his crew became a part of its body, despite being far out at sea. The Sea God also managed to assimilate every single person on Isma's Island within itself, and in the span of a few days. In chapter 312, we hear Isma's story about the Sea God and get to know her and her island's history. During that recollection, she mentions that of late, the entire village had gone silent and that people were shutting themselves indoors. Isma can't be much older than Isidro, and Isidro himself is barely a teenager. She remembers a time when the village's kids would tease her about her mother having supposedly been a Marrow, but of late, she doesn't even see those kids. It's like the world went quiet when that strange wind swept through it, Isma says, and though she doesn't know it, she's spot on about the correlation between that wind and what's happening on her island. Like we told you guys, the Sea God broke free thanks to Femto's doing, and it was now more active than it had been in hundreds of years. It consumed every last being that lived on Isma's Island and sent them back to their homes as a part of its being. Each human that was consumed by the Sea God turns into a tentacle monster, but tentacle monsters are too conspicuous to trick travelers. So, the god gives them humanoid forms that resemble the appearance of the citizens of Innsmouth from H.P. Lovecraft's work. Because of this, Guts' party doesn't question the villagers' strange behavior much, just thinking of them as isolated and shy. And besides, they couldn't even leave if they wanted to because the sea slugs had banged up Roderick's ship bad enough for it to require emergency repairs. So a stop at the island was inevitable. The group spends the day wandering the village, and at night, they end up in the middle of a sea slug nest. Guts and Serpico do their best to try and keep them at bay long enough to figure out an escape route. Even Farnace gets in on the action, and Roderick comes to realize just how useless human weapons are against Inhumans. Serpico fares well against the tentacles, but when it comes to their Kraken extensions, his Sylph sword simply cannot get through their thick skin. This effectively leaves Guts by himself to contend with all of them. To make matters worse, Bonebeard's ship climbs the side of the hill and joins the fray, with the uber slug we mentioned earlier straight chillin' in its hull, its tentacles and eyes popping out of every opening available. As soon as Guts realized they were massively outnumbered, the Berserker armor tried to get the jump on it. He consciously suppressed it, but fighting krakens and tentacles and constantly firing his arm cannon, which could just as easily dislocate his shoulder if he wasn't careful, was making Guts realize he had no other choice. He was fighting an immensely powerful astral enemy on the night of a full moon, no less. What made this full moon different was that it was significant to the sea god, which meant his powers would be at their peak. Taking the entire situation into account, the Black Swordsman came to the conclusion that he needed the Berserker on his side, and so he let loose. What followed was another one-sided massacre, only this one was far more grisly than the one on the ship. At least on that occasion, Guts was in total control of his movements. He'd have killed the sea slugs and the seahorse's sailors alike were he to have gone berserk then. This time, he had a big enough target to focus on before he could get to small fries like his friends. The way the Berserker armor seems to work is that it focuses on the biggest target first, and then cuts its way through everything else. The first move Guts made after going berserk was to leap for the sea slug inside the Captain Shark Rider, because that was the source of most of the others present on the surface. He made it to the ship in one leap, slicing his way through whatever Dragon Slayer touched, and then jammed it into the sea slug's face with another leap, which was powerful enough to break through an armored hull. He was immediately set upon by a kraken, but he sliced his way out of it and continued to slaughter every marine monster in fight. What would have taken the whole night and the next day for an army to accomplish, Berserker Guts did in a few minutes. His fighting style had become so feral that he was tearing out sea slug eyes from their sockets with his armor's teeth. It took him all of 2 chapters to decimate most of the sea slugs that attacked him, and force Bonebeard into a second retreat. But once he was finished with the monsters, his gaze turned to the humans. Guts was about to target his own comrades when he was broken out of the Berserker's hold thanks to Shirke and the Moonlight Boy. With that, round 2 came to an end, and it was once again a conclusive victory for Guts, though in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that impressive. The sea god's tentacles and slugs have a very limited range of motion. Due to their size and structure and the fact that they can only use biting or smothering as attack motions, they're pretty much sitting ducks for a guy like Guts. But the sheer number of these things that attacked him at the island gave him a proper run for his money, so much so that he used the Berserker armor's full power for the 3rd time in his life. The other 2 occurred whilst fighting the Dragon Apostle Grunbelt and the Dread Emperor Ganishka's Makara Core, which were 2 of his toughest battles. So, while he won again, Guts knew he had basically repelled an incursion and not won the war itself. Were he to leave the island with his companions, the sea god would continue practicing its heinous ways on other sailors as unfortunate as them. Besides, if they left in their broken ship, there was no guarantee they wouldn't attack them again before the sun came up, so the decision was made. The sea god would be dealt with that very night. This brings us to the main event of this video, that being Guts vs. Sea God Round 3, the final battle. Shirke knew just how lucky they were that Guts resisted the ode of the Berserker armor when he did. She didn't know that that was actually the Moonlight Boy helping his father out, but she did finish that task by successfully pulling Guts from his Berserker state. He reprimanded her for it because she made the dangerous decision of jumping onto his back while the armor was active, but he thanked her nonetheless. He knew that without Shirke, he would have been done for. In order to achieve their task of defeating the sea god, our group of heroes needed to divide themselves into 2 groups, and both of them needed this young mage's assistance. The first group would be Guts and Shirke, with their task being to venture into the sea god's cave and confront him. The second group would be everyone else aboard the seahorse, whose task it was to stay on the ship and away from the island's shores so as to avoid those tentacles and sea slugs as much as possible. Farnese would be the key magical defense of the ship, being the caster of the formation of 4, while the men handled any physical monsters that managed to get past it. Once everything was set up, Shirke entered her luminous body and held back the full body of the Berserker armor, so Guts could operate at near max capacity without losing his mind. With that accomplished, the pair set off towards the sea god's lair to put an end to the night's festivities. They cross a broken stone statue that looks like an ancient seal, and although Shirke's body isn't technically present, you can still feel the immense spiritual pressure coming off of the sea god's body. When they get inside, they realize that fighting their way to his main body the conventional way was simply not going to work. There were enough sea slugs inside the god's den to sink a fleet of 1,000 ships, and no matter how agile Guts became as the Berserker, even he would not be able to engage all of them without running into major issues. For instance, when Shirke realizes just how many tentacles and sea slugs they'll have to fight through, she suggests Guts uses a bottleneck to give himself some breathing space. Now, from a conventional standpoint, her idea isn't bad, but this isn't a conventional situation. Guts needs room to swing Dragon Slayer to its full potential, and besides, fighting his way through the whiskers of the sea god would make his enemy plummet before he ever got to the god himself. He needed to be in top shape for the big guy, so Guts decided that instead of cutting his way to the sea god, he would cut his way through it. No matter how big and powerful a creature might be, once its heart is punctured, they all die the same. The sea god's heart was likely several meters below sea level on the outside, but Guts didn't plan to attack him outside. He was going to attack his heart directly by entering the sea god's mouth and traversing its internal anatomy. Guts' expertise as a killer came in quite handy in that regard. He has extensive knowledge on the anatomy of living beings, and most living beings' bodies function the same way, just with slight variations that make them unique. Most living beings have a brain, for example. They have eyes, they have hearts, which is what Guts came looking to puncture with respect to the sea god, and they have stomachs. That last bit is where Guts touches base inside the sea god, and turns out its belly is massive enough to house dozens of broken ships. He calls it a legendary ship graveyard, and Shirke briefly comments on the abhorrent nature of the sea god, who makes those he consumes a part of itself. Keep this detail in mind because it's important to understanding the final segment of this video. As the young mage struggles to understand how they're going to breach the sea god's stomach lining, a bunch of stomach acid falls into the stomach, giving them the answer they need. Guts tells Shirke the stomach acid will carry them to the top, so all they needed to do was not get dissolved before that happens. It started off well enough, but soon the Black Swordsman was swarmed by isopod-looking creatures that resided in the sea god. These parasites were gaining on him quickly, so he took a leap of faith and jumped into the spot where Shirke told him the sea god's heart was, Dragon Slayer first. He opened a cavity wide enough for the air pressure to pull him into the space between the sea god's organs. From there, he makes his way to the heart chamber, which sounds easier than it actually was. He had to fight his way through countless insect-themed parasites to get to it, and, in classic Berserk fashion, that's where the real trouble began. Even when Guts and Shirke were in the sea god's stomach, they could hear its pulse, which was as loud as cannon fire. In fact, the young mage mistakes it for the seahorse's cannons, but Guts corrects her, and realization is chilling. That feeling gets worse once they make it to the heart because its beating is much stronger than Guts' body. So far, the Black Swordsman only had to deal with critters, and because the sea god's body was big enough for him to swing Dragon Slayer without interruption, he kept muscling forward. Now that he was close to its heart, he realized how dense the atmosphere was. It felt like he was underwater, which only made the pulse of the sea god's heart that much more of a problem. The volume and strength of a sound wave differs through different mediums. Gases carry sound the worst, solids carry sound the best, and liquids are somewhere in the middle. The sea god's heart chamber felt like the bottom of the ocean to Guts, which might as well have been solid considering the amount of pressure he was resisting. He knew that if he didn't end things soon, the booming of this creature's heart would kill him. He was already going numb from its impact, and to make matters worse, several new monsters had just spawned in front of him. However, as a seasoned warrior, Guts also knew that this renewed effort meant that the big octopus was on the ropes. With each step he took, the sea god's heartbeat intensified. It reached a high enough level of intensity by the time he got to the heart chamber that taking even a single step forward was difficult for Guts. Plus, the eel and jellyfish type parasites he was now fighting were only present in the heart chamber, which means they were the sea god's final line of internal defense. In other words, it was scared because it knew there was a very real threat to its life, so it broke out of its cave and started walking towards the open ocean. One step from the sea god was enough to send out such a huge tidal wave that it drowned the remnants of Isma's island and nearly did the same thing to Roderick's ship. Guts became aware of the fact that his target was on the move because that kind of thing is pretty hard to miss when you're inside of it, so he knew he had to pick up the pace. But the more he tried to do so, the stronger the sea god's heartbeat became, and the worse his condition got. Guts gets numerous opportunities to bypass the monsters and go directly for the heart, but each time he tries to do so, he's repelled by its pulse. At one point, 5 eel monsters chomp down on him at the same time in an attempt to keep him in place as they devour him, but Guts just slices his way out of their hole. By this point, the sea god is having an anxiety attack because nothing he sends at this guy seems to kill him, so his heartbeat just keeps intensifying to the point it actually blows Guts off his feet. He has to juggle between balancing himself, killing incoming monsters, and holding on to his sanity for dear life because that's how powerful the pulse had become. Guts was bleeding from his eyes, ears, and mouth before he could even finish off the parasites, and by the time he had done so, he was effectively deaf and blind. He couldn't even hear the cannon fire from the seahorse that was bombarding the sea god's exterior, and he he had to ask Shirke whether he'd killed all the eels or not. The seahorse was safe as long as Farnace's barrier held. The sea god had recalled Bonebeard and every other tentacle and slug to defend its main body. He was going to try to drown everything around himself by taking a deep plunge, creating a whirlpool. Roderick was brave enough to start circle bombardment on the thing, but that made matters worse for Guts on the inside. Shirke was in tears as she realized how far Guts had pushed himself for this mission. She did her best to guide him towards the heart, sightless as he was, but even though they were barely half a dozen steps away from slashing distance, they couldn't make it. Guts kept falling with each step because the sea god's heartbeat kept intensifying each step. He knew he had it rattled, but if he couldn't function, it was all for nothing. That's when help came in the form of an unexpected source. A school of hundreds of Marrows, presumably led by Isma's mother, made their way to the sea god's body and bombarded it with their singing. Marrows are basically mermaids, and there are many legends about a mermaid's song forcing sailors overboard, driving them crazy, all sorts of things. The sirens from Greek mythology have a similar skill set, but they're considered to be evil creatures. The Marrows of Berserk are definitely good aligned because they didn't even wait for the instruction to go and start murking Octopus Head. Their song canceled out the pulse of the sea god, which made the environment within the heart chamber ideal for movement. Guts was passed out because of the pulses booming at this point, so Shirke had to scream to his soul to wake him up. And no, we don't mean that just metaphorically, we mean it literally. The Black Swordsman regained consciousness long enough to taunt the Berserker armor into helping him move, and with his mage's guidance, he finally cut the sea god's heart open. It made the evil deity regurgitate a whole lot of blood and all of the ships in its stomach. Finally, the sea god had died. The Marrows played a crucial role in its death, but for the most part, this fight had been fought by Guts. He nearly drowned within the sea god's body because he couldn't move or see properly, but he was saved by a manifestation of the Moonlight Boy's ethereal body and the Marrows that helped him with the sea god. What's even better is that it only took a few hours of first aid to patch him up this time, not weeks like before. Yes, he had help in the form of Shirke, his comrades, and the Marrows, but let's be realistic here. Guts might as well have committed suicide had he gone up against the sea god without their support. This is a massive change from his days hunting apostles through the darkness by his lonesome, but it is a welcome one because he's going to need all the help he can get if he wants to replicate this success against the God Hand. Why Guts killing the sea god proves he can handle the God Hand. From an astral standpoint, the sea god can be equated with the God Hand for a number of reasons, but the main one we want to discuss here is the fact that Guts' brand reacts to it in a similar fashion to how it reacts to the God Hand. In chapter 318, as soon as Guts gets close to the mouth of the sea god's cave, his brand starts gushing blood. He doesn't feel the pain that comes with it thanks to the Berserker armor, but the way that it just doesn't stop running like a geyser is very reminiscent of what happens whenever Guts or Casca come close to a God Hand member. Like we mentioned at the beginning of this video, the brand reacts to the concentration of evil within a person, and the sea god was plenty evil based on what we saw from it in its short time in the series. Moreover, its appearance and powers are very similar to another character from the series that appeared not long before it, that being Ganishka's Shiva form. If you guys have seen our video on Ganishka's Shiva form, or the video we did on Guts' battle with Ganishka, you will know our opinion on whether the Black Swordsman could have taken it down or not. A lot of that boils down to the fact that he defeated the sea god, and the sea god is likely the same size as Ganishka, if not even bigger. The guy's head was the size of a hill above the surface of water, and when he moved, he didn't swim, he walked. This means that the sea god's feet were likely planted on the ocean floor, and we're not mistaking the shelf for the floor here, guys. There's another similarity between the Dread Emperor's Shiva form and the sea god, which is their ability to turn those they've come into contact with into their thralls. The sea god does this by devouring his targets and assimilating them into his whiskers, while Shiva accomplishes it by stepping on living humans, killing them, and then transforming their remains into pseudo-apostles that look like him. Their storyline emergence is reversed in the sense that Shiva brought about the end of the world of reason, while the sea god emerged because of it, but put side by side, their powers and the scope of their abilities would line up pretty well. So, if Guts managed to kill the sea god, he should have also been able to take care of Ganishka with the help of his crew. Sure, entering the mouth of a fire-breathing demon was far more difficult than entering the mouth of a creature that wanted to eat you, but you get our point. And if you still don't get how all of this relates to the God Hand, then all you have to do is follow the sea god fight from the moment Guts enters its heart chamber. Because it's the sea god's heart that, in our opinion, foreshadows how Berserk is going to end, with Guts running Dragon Slayer through the idea of evil. The sea god's heart is a carbon copy of the form we see the idea of evil take at the end of chapter 82. That still of Griffith arriving in front of a gigantic human heart with eyes all over it is one that will never leave our minds. So you can imagine how shocked we were when we saw Miura repeat the same design for the sea god's heart. Now, obviously, this could be coincidence as well, but Miura wasn't the kind of writer who would have things happen in this series just for the sake of it, unless he was writing dialogue for Puck, of course. He deliberately showed us Guts taking down a monster as big as Shiva to tell us that had he been at ground zero for the Great Roar, things could have played out differently. Instead of Skull Knight's sword, which was fated to bring causality to fruition, it would be Dragon Slayer cutting into Ganishka's flesh until all the evil flooded out of him. Miura had the habit of making callbacks to earlier events in a brand new setting so that the psychological effects compound on his characters. And nowhere was this clearer than the incarnation ceremony, which was a combination of everything that had come before it. Ganishka's Shiva form wasn't at the level of the God Hand in terms of power, but it got pretty close and now serves as the battery for the world's state of Fantasia. So yes, while it would likely be more difficult for him to kill Shiva Ganishka, Guts could still accomplish it with his supporters. And this is how we know that he's ready to handle the God Hand. He just needs to step out of their story entirely. Now that the astral and physical worlds are overlapping, it isn't too much of a stretch to think that Griffith might try to bring the idea of evil into the mix. And one of the ways in which he could do that is by conducting a massive ritual to create an entity large and powerful enough to receive the idea as its heart. Because everything now has a physical form in Berserk, it's not an exaggeration to think that this megalithic entity would have a body of flesh. And if that does end up being the case, it's game over for the bad guys. Guts has proven time and again that no physical barrier can stop him from achieving his goals, and that goes for astral entities as well. The reason he keeps coming up short against Griffith is because he's still being controlled by the latter's story. Though he doesn't want to admit it, much of Guts' life since he joined the Falcons has been guided by Griffith's words and actions. Had he not gotten it into his head to become the Falcon's equal, all of this could have been avoided. But at the same time, even his pursuit of revenge is inspired by Griffith, for whenever he falters and thinks of retiring to peace, he's reminded that his leader would oppose those who opposed his dream with his heart, body, and soul. Guts' true dream is to get revenge on the man he once looked up to, no matter how many times he says otherwise. And as long as Griffith continues to inform his choices, he'll never be able to touch him. Once that situation changes, however, we're pretty sure Guts could kill at least one God Hand member by himself, if not all 5 of them, especially if Skull Knight backs him up. Marvelous verdict! But that's what we think based on our over-analysis of what was, in our opinion, the most important fight in Berserk. What do you guys think? Was Guts versus the Sea God just a big setup for the God Hand? What's your favorite fight in the entire Berserk franchise? Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, don't forget, keep on struggling, strugglers.